So welcome into our second session of Agora and the Midnight Sun. Last time I have introduced a kind of shock treatment of the mind. What happens to people who all of a sudden get into trouble. I used Dostoevsky, I used Kaiserling, and also myself, because when I got into trouble, I understood at that time Dostoevsky's trouble. I was 19 years old, and I knew in detail what happened to Dostoevsky 100 years ago, when he stood in front of the firing squad and had 3 minutes. What went through his mind? So I knew that from literature, and I never expected such a shock treatment will happen one day to me as well. And so it is a shock treatment when all of a sudden you realize that things are not the way they were yesterday. Everything is different. In my case, my father told me, look underneath of the candle. What do you see there? And I said, I don't see anything. He said, look carefully. There is a little shadow. What do you mean by that? You know, in these circumstances, we cannot trust anybody. I will try to hide you in our house for a week or two. It was 5 years. So the content of these 5 years is difficult to discuss, but it is a shock treatment. Out of that, one gets into oneself and asks a question, what am I? Why I am here? Why did it happen to me? All my friends can go on living the way. Why it happened to me? So it is a beginning of a great investigation. Something you are not used to, you are not trained to do, because all of us live our lives externally, from day to day. Exactly the same happened to humanity in its history, that humanity lived the way from day to day and did not have to get into oneself. Everything what we have created with our minds made it possible to integrate us into the world which we have accepted as being as such as it appeared to us. We have created beautiful theories how everything was created. Never trusting ourselves that it is our own product. Until probably 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, something happened that people started asking these very questions. What am I? Why am I here? And there were many answers. Why? I summarized them in form of fetishism, animism, polytheism, monotheism, and then all other theories explaining how we appeared here. One man I mentioned, and I always emphasize, is Xenophanes, 6th century BC man who gave us the basic theory. Anthropomorphism, everything what we have is man-made in terms of explanation. And hypostatization that what is man-made is thrown into the world, and we find it there. This was very difficult to swallow it, the way he presented it. In polytheistic Greece, he was persona non grata. And ever since, he is not even mentioned by philosophers. This is the key theory of human mind about the world we live in. After that came other attempts to explain who we are. It is remarkable that we can look back and see that in this very investigation, there were basically two approaches, which we now call the Western approach and Eastern approach. This Western approach produced a great man who gave us the foundation of this belief, how our mind works. It was Aristotle. Our mind works logically. He gave us basic logic, which was kind of self-evident. We have two eyes, we have two hands, two legs, so everything is in twos. So it was convincing, but he grasped the law behind it, which is in our mind, formulated it in form of logic, which is very simple. First law of logic is principle of identity. What is. What is not, is not. Is anybody willing to argue with it? It's clear. Identity. Second law, based on law of identity. Is and is not cannot be the case. Will you be willing to argue? What is identity. Second law, is and is not at the same time cannot be, because what is and what is not is not. You see how self-evident the second law is. Now the third law. Things are either or. Clear. Either is or is not. They cannot be both. So it is called excluded middle. These laws were received as self-evident. He did not state that they came, from some kind of revelation. But it was a revelation of Aristotle's mind. And he, at that time, didn't know that it was a revelation of somebody who speaks Greek language. And that Greek language is a part of family of certain type of languages, which are rather similar. So whoever in the upper classes of so-called educated people were able to understand these three laws, embrace it and say, that's it. It cannot be otherwise. This Aristotelian logic produced a corresponding theory of syllogism, which is kind of dance of sentences according to certain rhythm of validity and invalidity. You have to start from upper classes, highest classes, possible classes. Something what is self-evident. Of course, there is a mind which believes that there must be something self-evident from which we can deduce everything else. So there is this classical syllogistic example. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Can you argue with it from the first sentence? Of course, we believe that we have not seen one single case that somebody is immortal. Later on, it was reformulated. Up to now, all people who were born lived, later died. This is the meaning of the all men are mortals. But it was accepted as self-evident principle. You know, this self-evident principle goes through the mind of Greeks. Greeks were the people who took this idea seriously and built many other fields out of it. Mathematics, geometry. Geometry has to be formulated also in similar way. We call it deductively. Deduction is a derivation of sentences from higher sentences. And in order to do it, you have to assume that there are the higher sentences called axioms. You have to assume that there are, and Greeks define them as self-evident for everybody, for all the times. My God, if you have something what is forever self-evident, you can milk out of it everything else. This is what we have been doing in our Western tradition. We believe that there are self-evident notions, axioms. For 3,000 years, there were only very few people who dared to question it. And they were regarded as misfits. And to question that maybe the self-evident axioms are not so self-evident. But for a great majority of mankind, Western mankind, nothing was changed. Generation after generation of highly educated people had certain basic beliefs, and this was the belief. There is deductive way of reasoning which needs certain basic beliefs which are clear, distinct, self-evident. It is not only in geometry, as you see, geometry is here a prototype of all other creeds and beliefs, which are based on clear, distinct, self-evident. It is the same religious mind which believes in this very foundation. But you have it in geometry. Classical science of the mind, which was produced by Greeks in close connection between Aristotle and Euclid. Euclid is continuing in his work, Elements, foundation of geometry, which was taught until 19th century, and there were very few people who dared to question it. One of them was Italian monk Saccheri in 17th century, who questioned it. You can imagine he didn't get very far with it. Because the gremium of intellectuals, of those who know, will suppress this kind of teaching. But there were people who tacitly, mentioned, I have doubts, about the whole foundation. And also I have doubt about fifth postulate. And it was fifth postulate, parallel postulate of Euclid, which states, to the point next to a line, there can be only one line drawn, and they will never meet. All through the history, there were bright minds which had doubts about it. But again, it was better to keep quiet and not to rock the boat. It was here, where in 19th century, great German mathematician Gauss had this serious doubt, but he was so well integrated into his society that he did not dare to talk openly about it. As university professor, he was afraid to rock the boat. Most university professors are the same. They don't like to rock the boat because you have to be promoted and you have to get goodies. And Professor Gauss was not an exception. But he has conscience, mathematical conscience, which told him that there is something wrong, that this fifth postulate, how can we use this fifth postulate, believing that it must be the case, when empirically we cannot follow any line above the ceiling? Point. How can I know that above the ceiling something else could not happen? Of course I assume, oh my God, I assume that above the ceiling everything works just like here. I assume, my God, we base our thinking on assumptions. If this is the case, what happened with the axioms? Of course, the axioms are assumptions. What went on all these 3,000 years? There are no clear, distinct, self-evident statements. They are assumptions. Our whole foundation of our mind works on basis of assumptions. That's a revolution of first rate. But Professor Gauss didn't want to announce it and march under the new flag. He mentioned it to a few students. And the students were young, inexperienced. They did not have to fight for tenure. One of them was Hungarian, Bolai. The other one, Russian, Lobachevsky. And the third one was German, Riemann. Each of them assumed different thing about his fifth postulate. Of course, they develop a different geometry. All of a sudden, instead of one geometry, which was assumed to be geometry of the earth, geometry. Greeks made out of it mental science, abstract science. Egyptians had triangle on earth. Greeks lifted it into the mind and then established teaching of the mind, which was based on axioms. In the 19th century, students of Gauss continue. And they changed axioms into assumptions, each of them producing a different type of geometry. And now you have 4 geometries: Euclidean, Lobachevskian, Bolaian, and Riemannian. Of course, none of them is about the earth. It has nothing to do with the earth. It is in Greek tradition about the mind and operation of the mind. It was a tremendous insight into working of our minds. Of course, it will take a long time before young people can accept it, because they are programmed, culturally, civilizationally programmed. And our schooling system is based on following certain historical paradigms. You are not here to change them. You are here to continue. So it will take a long time before it is clear what we can deduce from it. Our mind operates on basis of assumptions. So where these assumptions are, how we get them, we don't know. But it is a tremendous progress that there is nothing solid, nothing clear, distinct, self-evident. Of course, this derivation will take a long time still nowadays. If this is generally understood, we would not have all this mess in our society, where people are running about things, they are convinced this is it and it cannot be otherwise. Our educational system failed entirely, to educate new generation on basis of the school of Gauss, of these 3 students. This is a lesson in our thinking. And still, up to now, it is not a general property of education. It is easier to educate our people ideologically, left, right, and be convinced that this is the case. To see the world through type of glasses you get from your parents, from your environment, and never giving up on that. It requires thinking, and thinking hurts. So it was a long way from Aristotle and Euclid through the whole history of Christianity, of Protestantism, up to 19th century, up to 20th century, 21st century. Now, what happened in the other half of the world? And when I talk about this Western Aristotelian, there are not many people who can trace it, who are interested in tracing it and understanding it, how it developed. So is also the Eastern way, which became the backbone of different way of thinking. It was Chinese way of thinking. Yin-yang is the model of one entity and the other entity. And I will try to this is the Western. There are two things. What is, what is not, is not. Is and is not cannot be. If P, then P. P and not P is not the case. P or Q. These are these three laws: identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle. So this is the pattern which ruled our Western mind, how it works. The Eastern, the Eastern has a different model. It is not P and Q. It is P and Q integrated. The world is not the world of opposites. Things are included. It is a kind of pantheistic world where you see the world not fighting. Even you are fighting, of course Chinese are fighting too, but the idea of the world is inclusion. There is no excluded middle. It is part of tradition. Poets and musicians were using it. It is a different way of seeing the world. Underneath, there were probably very similar people to our people. They were fighting, killing each other. But their idea of the world in which we should live should be this self-including world. Now comes 20th century. In the West, we have brilliant people who are working in the field of science. I have to say a few words about 300 years of science in the West. Everything started with a new approach to the world. It started through astronomy. The corresponding astronomy to medieval concept of the world was Ptolemaic astronomy, which believes that we are the belly button of the universe and everything turns around us. You see, this is working hand in hand with Bible, with Quran. We are the belly button. Center of the universe. This very view, when attacked, was always dangerous. There was a very powerful church who punished everybody who dared to attack this view. And we know that those who try to argue with the church, many of them lost their lives. Giordano Bruno, one of the great Italians, was burned at the stake in the year 1600 because he was one of the avant-gardes who believed that the world in which we live is this large world in which we play a not a very important role. We are part of the whole. We call it in philosophy pantheism. He introduced pantheistic view about nature of the universe, and for that he had to pay. He was burned at the stake. Talking about Giordano Bruno, I have to mention something what happened on our campus during the 90s. We had a brilliant British scientist here, Keith Rancorn. You remember him, probably quite a few remember him. Keith Rancorn from Cambridge University. He came and was had a chair of Chapman in Geophysical Institute. He was a very interesting man. Before I met him, he met my son, Paul, because he was interested in music. And when they met together, Paul mentioned that his dad is teaching philosophy here. He said, you have to introduce me to him. So we became friends, and we had regular meetings together. We taught courses together, which was not well received by his colleagues, you know, that he's losing his mind with a philosopher, you know. And he, among other things, he was well known all over the world, and he became member of Papal Commission in Rome, which had a task to rehabilitate Galileo. He was leaving for Rome, and we met together, and I gave him ideas, you know, how to argue for Galileo politically. He came back, and we celebrated his success. Galileo will be rehabilitated in Rome. And immediately he asked me, Rudy, whom else shall we rehabilitate? I told him, Keith, Giordano Bruno. He said, oh, I know, you know, he was burned at the stake, but can you give me more? So I give you the whole information. And so I wrote down about Giordano Bruno, and he told me, you know, you can better argue it than I in Rome. I will try to get you on Papal Commission. So I thought, okay, I would go. So he tried, he sent papers and credentials, and the presiding director of the commission was later Pope, the German Pope. It was 92, 93. He looked at my credentials, and he told Keith, there is no room for rehabilitation of Giordano Bruno as long as I am in charge of this commission. Roman Catholic Church will never rehabilitate Giordano Bruno. We would go too far, we went too far with Galileo. So Keith came back and told me, I cannot get you on the commission. You know, as long as the presiding officer, later the Pope, you will never get on it, and I don't know if I will dare, after what he said, if I will dare to argue it. Let's forget it. So we had to forget it. Giordano Bruno, probably his soul knows that there was an attempt to rehabilitate him, but we did not succeed. Maybe he does not care. So this was Giordano Bruno. But what happened in the science of last 300 years was that science, after they liberated themselves from the onslaught of the church, established their own ideology. The ideology, of course, is in a way continuation of the way of thinking of the past. They divided the world into the world which is material and the world which is soft within us. Primary qualities out there, sum total of the physical world, and secondary qualities of the mind. Scientific pursuit has to be directed towards primary qualities, objective qualities, and should not be contaminated through subjective qualities. It is a new dogma that we study the external world, objective world of primary qualities, the world of matter. What is not matter does not matter. So it went on for next 300 years, and in many fields it's still the basic approach. When it will come, to study of man's mind, it will be the mind, never mind, the matter, the brain. We study the brain, forgetting that brain does not study itself. It is still up to now, more or less, belief that brain is that what gives us all answers. At the beginning of 20th century, with the advent of quantum theory, there were serious implications of this new physical theory. The implications were that it looks that what is particle is sometimes a particle, otherwise when we don't observe it, it is a wave. But this goes against excluded middle. Forget it. This is not a way we can think about it. You see, the lesson from Aristotle, excluded middle, will lead you to reject any other theory of the mind. It was Bohr's Institute in Copenhagen, which had brilliant leaders who were not afraid that they will deviate from the tradition. The leader of them, Niels Bohr, is the man who had serious questions about this third law in quantum physics, excluded middle. When he started talking about it among physicists, they told him, you know, it is against the whole tradition. It is against Newton. It is the best of the tradition is based on excluded middle. I don't know who was it who mentioned to him, you know, there are people who have a different way of seeing it. They have a theory without excluding middle. He asked, where is it? In China. He decided to go to China because it supported his internal belief. He went to China, met people, physicists. He said, yes, this is the pattern, you know, it is all yin yang. Hooray. He got a great support. He did not care for yin yang. You know? He had enough support, spiritual support for his own approach and experiments. Of course, it was not well received, you know, by many of his colleagues. It was kind of betrayal of our tradition. It was a door opened to the mind of the observer who observes atomic events. And these atomic events, by its very nature, are not within five senses. So they would fall into category of non-sense. But the continuation of the serious research has to go below senses. But how? How can we think about what is not received by five senses? That's a question. Experiments and experimental work required mathematics. Again, what is mathematics? It is a play of the mind. But at this very moment you leave the world of common man. This is what happened to quantum physics. Big battle between Bohr and Einstein. Einstein, by the way, is the author of quantum theory. He got scared and turned against it and continued his meetings with Bohr, which was summarized in this famous, does God play dice with the universe? Most scientists were lost. He said, two old folks have nothing else to do than come together and puff their cigars and cigarettes upon each other and enjoying themselves, talking about nonsense, whether God plays dice with the universe. For 30 years they were coming together. They must have smoked a lot of cigarettes and they did not solve the problems. Why? Because it was based on different assumptions. Assumption of Niels Bohr was that we have nothing but statistical distribution on basis of which we can make a judgment. Einstein believed that there is reality behind the scene. This was personal belief, personal philosophical belief, based on assumption which can never meet. You cannot convince Roman Catholic if you are Protestant, and vice versa, or Republican, or Coghill, you know. How could you? It is based on assumption. So we have learned a lesson here, that we have nothing but assumptions. In the meantime, quantum mechanics and quantum theory became very popular among scientists.